Guten Morgen und herzlich willkommen. Ich freue mich, dass Sie da sind. Der Vortrag wird ja gleich auf Englisch stattfinden, deswegen würde ich tatsächlich meine Begrüßung auch auf Englisch machen. Wenn ich das richtig sehe, können Fragen auf Deutsch und auf Englisch und diversen anderen Sprachen gestellt werden. But first of all, I'd like to switch to English and welcome you. I'm very happy that you're here. My name is Rebecca Mack. I'm the head of the Diversity and Anti-Discrimination Office at Freie Universität Berlin, which was set up last year. The main goal of our work is to promote diversity and, consequently, to reduce discrimination. We provide confidential counseling for those experiencing or witnessing discrimination, and we are developing a complaints procedure for discrimination cases. Furthermore, we realize events, lectures, and workshops on the topics of anti-discrimination and empowerment, primarily organized by my colleagues Anita Orkiszewska and Aline Kwandl, who are sitting here, and whom I would like to express my gratitude. Some of you might have attended the event with Meron Mendel and Saba Nur-Cheema last semester, or the lecture by Karim Faridoni or Emilia Roig this semester. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's lecture with Gadi Algazi, which is also the last event of the series in the summer term. Gadi Algazi teaches medieval history at Tel Aviv University, but also has an academic background in Arabic and Islamic studies, literature, and he has received his doctorate in Göttingen with a study on seigneurial power and violence in the later Middle Ages. Among many other academic positions, he was an associate at the Max Planck Institute for History of Science and at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. Gadi has always also been an activist who is engaged in various grassroots movements, striving to form Arab-Jewish partnerships in order to work together in solidarity and non-violently against inequalities, for social change, for full equality and social justice. We are very happy that Gadi has agreed to speak to us today. In his lecture, Foundation for Life in Common, a historical perspective on Israel and Palestine, Gadi Algazi will shed light on the historical developments that have led to the current situation in Israel and Palestine in order to take a look at how to shape a future of peaceful coexistence, dignity, and equality. The lecture is being recorded, and after the talk, you have the opportunity to ask questions. The floor is yours, dear Gadi.
Thank you very much. I think I need my paper. So einen schönen guten Morgen and a wonderful good morning. Thanks so much for this opportunity. I've been asked to speak in English, and so I will, but you're free to use any language that I understand, even German. Das ging auch. When we come to the Q&A or to any kind of comments or discussions that we might have. I gladly accepted this opportunity, and I'm grateful that you're here this morning. What I'll have to say is not necessarily easy, but let's see how it goes. And I should also say I'm speaking in my name. I do not represent any institution, academic or otherwise, so the responsibility is also my own. So I shall not say much about the present, about the war, and focus on the road that has led us here. I shall not attempt to count or estimate the deaths, the horror, the massacre, the hunger, the famine, the amount of destruction and suffering. You can inform yourself about all this without much effort. But precisely for this reason, because I would not talk about the war directly, I shall have to say a few words about some people that I especially care about. Some of my Palestinian friends within Israel have lost many members of their family in Gaza. Whole Palestinian families have been wiped out. Think about a Palestinian student from Jaffa who's studying at Tel Aviv. For months now, she has been trying to reestablish contact with her family members, with her relatives, and with her father, who may or may not be still alive somewhere in Gaza Strip. I'm thinking of the children, of those children who have survived so far and are now suffering from hunger. and of old men and women, refugees, or the sons and daughters of refugees, who have been now displaced again and again and are now looking for shelter and water in the heat of the summer. And this is really a summer now. I'm also thinking naturally of the Israeli victims, especially, for example, of one of my former students whom I loved very much, a social activist and a grandmother who was killed with a husband on October 7th. I'm thinking of the hostages and their families. They are living in a state of existential fear, and many of them, perhaps even most of them, no longer believe that the release of the hostages is the top priority of the Israeli government. Some believe that the Israeli government uses the indescribable suffering of the hostages as a justification for the war, but does not really care about their lives. Now, as you perhaps know, protests against the war in Israel have been very, very modest in scope. The horrors of October 7 have taken their toll on what is left of our humanity after more than 50 years of military occupation. Still, the most important protests inside Israel are those of the hostages' families and activists, mostly women, who call on the Israeli government to accept a deal, a prisoner exchange that will save hostages' lives and end the war. Not a single victim on the Israeli side would be brought back to life by the bombing month after month of thousands of Palestinian civilians. Now, I know also about thousands of Palestinians detained, if you will, taken hostage by the Israeli army, both from Gaza and the West Bank, among them youths and children. Many of them are held without trial. They can be legitimately described as hostages too. I have known Palestinian political prisoners throughout my life, but here and in the following, I shall not engage in an accountancy of suffering. I have learned not to quantify suffering, not to play one form of suffering against the other. When we look at the human toll in Gaza, we have to admit that there is no proportion, no symmetry. The suffering and death are not equal. They're not symmetrical. But human beings are equal. They are vulnerable and precious. And all the forms of suffering and vulnerability count equally. So what we do share is vulnerability. And that perhaps could be a starting point for thinking about the future. More importantly, and that would be the basic premise of what I should say also historically, is that I refuse to use one form of suffering to deny or belittle the suffering of others. This applies first and foremost to us, Israelis. We are tempted to speak only about our own suffering, our own dead, wounded, missing, while ignoring Palestinian victims. But one form of suffering cannot be used to cancel out or deny the suffering of others. And we Israelis share responsibility for the war in Gaza and for the suffering of Palestinians over many decades, whether we agree with Israel's policies or not. Taking responsibility is always the first step. The imperative to refrain from denying or belittling others' suffering, even if this suffering is cynically used as propaganda, applies also to Palestinians and to all those who sympathize rightly with their plight, with their cause. Denial does not help us to come to terms with the present, and it does not help us to find a way toward a different future. And this also applies to the German public, sensitive to Jewish suffering and aware of their historical responsibility to exterminatory racism, but often tempted to belittle or ignore Palestinian suffering and Palestinian history. Neither Israel nor Palestine are mere extensions of the German past or of any simplified version of the German past. Palestinians have their own history, and so do Israelis. It is certainly true that these histories are connected, entangled, if you will, with European history. And it is true that there is a special German historical responsibility that we should acknowledge because the contemporary history of the Middle East in general and of Israel and Palestine in particular cannot be understood without the enduring legacy of European persecution, imperial domination, colonialism, and genocide. So I will try to say a few words about this toward the end of my talk, but in the meantime, my plea is simply to refrain as much as possible from projecting European and especially German concerns and sensibilities, Befindlichkeiten, on our region, on Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. Now, there is no way I could give you, an acceptable summary of events and processes in some, say, 60 minutes. That would be futile. I'm a historian, I live by the details, and if you want to go into the details, we'll try to do it by the end of the talk. And I will also say very little about the connected history, about Palestinian history. That is a matter that my Palestinian colleagues, historians, should and could do, and some of us have done this here far better. What I can offer, or I hope I can offer you, is a broad perspective, a basic framework for making sense of a complex history that many people around us talk about or are silent about or rather wish to forget about because it seems all too complicated. But I don't think we can simply accept this. So, we should start with Zionism, a Jewish political movement that emerged in Central Europe in the late 19th century and rapidly spread, now I'll do what professors always do, to Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. It's hard to believe how many Jews lived in this part of Europe before the Holocaust, but also before the great migrations of the early 20th century. Historically, and this is important, Zionism was by no means the only or the most popular national project among Jews. There were other projects of Jewish nationalism, especially in Eastern Europe, where millions of Jews were living at the end of the 19th century. There were also projects of Jewish integration into various European nationalism and also integration of Jews into projects of social change, socialist, and other projects. And generally speaking, non-Zionist movements were majoritarian among Jews, both in Europe and in the Arab world, before the Holocaust, before the destruction and dispersal of whole Jewish communities in the 1940s. So Zionism is not everything. It's not the only form of Jewish nationalism. It's not the only representative of Jewish nationalism. It's one historical path among others. Discrimination against Jews, the rise of modern anti-Semitism, and the formation of nation-states and national movements that often excluded Jews all gave rise to various strands of Jewish nationalism. This is understandable, and I see absolutely no reason to return to all debates about whether or not Jews were a people, a nation. Many Jews thought they were a people, and that's it. This is what counts. The point is rather that Zionism offered a specific version of a national project centered on the colonization of Palestine and the creation of a Jewish state. We need to pay attention to this peculiar combination of a project of nation building and a project of colonization. The history is entangled, but much of the future depends on the question whether we can disentangle them and think them differently. Zionist basic assumption was that Jewish collective existence could be transformed and secured through a project of mass colonization outside Europe. What did this involve? First, it meant transforming traditional longings and symbols into modern political claims. This is a familiar process by which modern national movements reinvent, if you will, reshape the past and translate symbols and ritual practices into enforceable rights. The love of Zion, in Hebrew, Ahavat Zion, a long tradition of attachment to an idealized, imagined homeland, was strong in some Jewish communities and weaker in others. That's an interesting history, but modern Zionism was not simply a version of the love of Zion of religious Jews. It was a political movement that sought to create a state. Second, there was, of course, a pattern of Jewish immigration in response to persecution and deteriorating conditions. Think about the Jewish move from the east to the west and then further to North America and partly to South America. Out of this given tradition, Zionism constructed something different again, not just immigration, but a movement of colonization. And the distinction is important. Only a minority of the Jews who came to Palestine for the past 100 years did so out of deep ideological conviction or commitment to Zionism. Most were immigrants and refugees seeking to escape persecution, to build a new life, or improve their conditions, as immigrants and refugees do. But Zionism set itself the task of turning immigrants and refugees into settlers to gain control over a country. And Palestine, as I don't need to tell you, was not empty. Its people, mostly but not all Palestinian Arabs, were not waiting for some external savior to liberate them from the shackles of the past. They were in the process of economic, social, and political development under the Ottoman Empire. This inevitably meant an ongoing conflict between the settlers and the indigenous people. Much has changed in the past 100 years, but basically this conflict is still raging in Israel and Palestine. Now, when you think about this conflict or other dramatic conflicts, what first comes to mind are wars and violent clashes, bombs, and so on and so forth. And this is also the image that captures media attention. But violence has deeper forms and less visible forms. So let's be honest. There is no colonization without appropriation, without dispossession, without a claim to take power. So our eyes are understandably fixed on the atrocities of modern warfare, especially the endless killing of civilians, but dispossession and exclusion, the systematic settlement in the service of acquiring resources and building power, is a major form of structural violence that involves countless acts of violence, large and small, over many years. So perhaps some of you think about the radical settlers in the West Bank, and I don't need to tell you I may tell you what they're doing, but think about the deeper violence encapsulated in taking people's land and water, in changing the very conditions in which people shape their lives, their life chances. Now, what I'm saying is familiar to any indigenous people, but easy to overlook from the outside. When we think of clashes and violence, we often think of guns and tanks. We don't think about tractors, bulldozers, fences, roads. But David Ben-Gurion, if you will, the founder of the State of Israel, recognized on several occasions that Zionist colonization was a form of organized aggression. My example is taken from 1938, the Palestinian revolt that took place between 1936 and 1939 during the British occupation of Palestine. The uprising was brutally crushed by the British military. The first phase of the uprising was broad-based, more popular, and began with a general strike, but failed to achieve any results. And the later stages, Palestinian armed groups attacked both British soldiers, forces, and Jews while Zionist militias joined the British military forces. So, in an informal discussion about the Palestinian attacks, Ben-Gurion candidly said, "When we say that the Arabs are the aggressors and we defend ourselves, we meaning the Jews or the Zionists, this is only one half of the truth." And I think this is pertinent to our days too. As regards our security and life, yes, we defend ourselves and our moral and physical position is not bad. But the fighting is only one aspect of the conflict, which is in its essence a political one. And politically, we are the aggressors. And they, the Arabs of Palestine, are defending themselves. Something's gone wrong here. I'm very sorry. It's my finger.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
That's far better. And Ben-Gurion continues, "The land, the villages, the mountains, the roads are in their hands. This country is theirs because they, the Palestinians, inhabit it. Whereas we want to come here and settle, and in their view, we want to take away from them their country." I think this is a lucid perception of the basic parameters of the ongoing conflict. The Zionist project of building a nation through colonization had a third aspect that I would like to outline. Not all Jewish immigrants and refugees were considered by Zionists good human material for the purposes of colonization. Some were considered too soft, too feminine, to serve as frontline settlers. Jews in the Arab world look too much like Arabs, like their Arab neighbors whose culture they largely shared and were initially not even considered as suitable carriers of the Zionist project. So the project of creating a new man differed from other projects of nation building precisely in that it sought to turn the colonization frontier into the hotbed of the new national identity. Now, Zionism did not invent all this. It modeled its project on early European settlement ventures from Argentina to Australia, from North America to South Africa, that took shape from the early modern period roughly to the 19th century. And we do have a generic name for this. We call it settler colonialism. Now, this term is now this is a problematic map. It's only about demography, but at least give you a sense of how widespread and important settler colonialism is for shaping the world that we live in. Now, the term settler colonialism is now widely used in political debates, and many people use it as a terrible curse or are reluctant to apply it to Zionism. But this is an analytical concept, and using the term is not the end of analysis, but its beginning. We do not simply subsume complex historical cases under theoretical concepts. We use them in order to discern important aspects and to generate questions. For instance, who were the settlers in this case? Why did they come? What was the situation of the indigenous people? How were both societies, the settler society and the indigenous society, affected by the conflict? How can an indigenous people recover and defend its collective rights? Can the settlers stop colonizing and begin to settle down? And most importantly, what are the possible ways out? So I have only tentative answers for some of these questions, but they are not academic questions. If from my point of view, you can live here and take the questions with you. They are far more important than anything else, because they are the key to understanding how we got here and what kind of paths we can choose in order to achieve something else. So let me try to note some of the distinctive features of this case. First one, as a settler colonial movement, Zionism arrived very late on the scene, mainly after the First World War. And this had wide-reaching implications. First, it allowed the Zionist project to advance very quickly in historical terms. You know, Israel was founded 30 years later. This is the pace of modern industrial capitalism. Second, it always had a problem of legitimacy. Colonialism was increasingly delegitimized after 1917 or after the Russian Revolution, after the First World War. So Zionists insisted that they were not engaged in a colonial enterprise of exploitation, say in setting up plantation where Arab workers would work, but in pure colonization. For Palestinians, this was not good news. It meant that instead of being exploited, they were to be excluded and eventually displaced. And there's a simple third distinctive feature. Israeli settler colonialism does not belong to the past. It's not a matter of post-colonial reflection. It's not a matter of truth and committees. It's not a matter of finding some place for the remaining indigenous people. It simply does not belong to the past. It is still ongoing, and Israel is the only country, but please correct me if I'm wrong, the only country that I know which incorporated in its basic law the goal of creating and expanding Jewish settlements. You have the quote there. There are problems with the translation. Some German newspapers could not bring themselves to translating precisely what the law says, but this is what it says. It is one of the goals of the state to expand colonization. So the wounds, unlike in other cases, are still open and they're bleeding. The first was temporality. The second distinctive feature is that when Zionists arrived in Palestine, the country was in the midst, as we said, of local process of modernization. It was already enmeshed in trade relations with the rest of the Middle East, and it was increasingly involved in the world market. Perhaps the most known and forgotten example is of the famous Jaffa oranges, Palestinian enterprise that preceded the Zionist one. But this is part of a new circulation of fruit and primary products in the late 19th century. So the struggle between settlers and indigenous people assumed different forms than, say, in Australia or Canada. Here was a partly commercialized economy with private property, unequally distributed, newspapers, and a cultural and political upheaval. So if this is the case, there was simply no reason to expect that colonization would be peaceful or that would be approved by the indigenous Palestinians out of stupidity or lack of political awareness. Some sections of the Zionist movement indeed told themselves that the indigenous Palestinians lacked national consciousness and would be incapable of a collective response. The truth is that resistance to Zionism galvanized, accelerate the development of Palestinian nationalism. So more realistic, and it is the only other quote we shall have today, don't worry, more realistic was the position of Ze'ev Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion's most serious rival within the Zionist movement, at least locally. In 1923, Jabotinsky told his readers, in Russian, if you want to know, that just like other peoples faced with colonists, the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, he says, would not reconcile themselves with settlement and would resist it as best as they can. Jabotinsky did not hesitate to compare Zionist settlers with the English colonists in North America or with the Spanish colonization of Central America. In order to make his basic point, every native population, he wrote, in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to get rid itself of the danger of being colonized. So, if indigenous resistance is comprehensible and constant, it is not going to be diffused by some interim agreements, as some Zionists were hoping. One should either stop the colonization process in order to achieve real peace, or prepare for a long, long, long conflict. And according to Jabotinsky, the Zionist colonization of Palestine had to continue, he was convinced, and it had to continue without Palestinian consent. So, he argued, conflict was inevitable. Hence, Jabotinsky's conclusion that we often quote today. An iron wall should be erected to allow the process of colonization to continue. I'm quoting, Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. For Jabotinsky, the iron wall meant primarily imperial patronage, military protection granted to the Zionist project by one of the imperial powers, about which I have said too little. And indeed, several imperial powers assumed this role from the 1920s till today. First the British, then after the Second World War, the declining French Empire, and especially since the 1960s, the rising, at the time, the rising American Empire. Now, this is a structural feature of Israel's position in the Middle East. It is particularly visible during this war, which could not have continued without a constant flow of bombs and ammunition from the US, and let us not forget, from Germany. So we should ask ourselves, what price Israelis pay for imperial protection? We should also ask, what price the Palestinians and the other peoples of the Middle East are paying for imperial hegemony? What kind of economic development is hindered by this path? What do they pay in terms of dictatorial regimes? And we should also ask whether the collective rights of Jews in the Middle East can be secured in the long term by imperial powers and their changing interests. They might like you. They might forget about you. But if we want to live and stay there, that's a huge question. Now, Jabotinsky's Iron Wall became the paradigm of Zionist policy, and it has shaped later Zionist and Israeli politics for decades to come. This is an amazing text. His basic argument was that as long as colonization continues, violent conflict and military power remain essential. Don't talk about peace. That's his message. And he was right. But the nature and structure of this iron wall kept changing over the time. Instead of relying exclusively on foreign imperial power to act as a protector, another option gradually gained in importance: the militarization of emergent Israeli society in general and of frontier settlements in particular. The Iron Wall would be made out of actual people. This is why we talk about settler colonialism, both because its implication for the indigenous people, not exploitation, but eviction, and because of its implication for the colonized people, because it is made out of the lives of human people. So people are both the instruments and the victims of this process. What then emerged is a society prepared for war, and we can see this especially in frontier settlements. Third implication, which I think is perhaps more optimistic, I'll try at least. In many cases around the world, especially between the 16th and the 19th centuries, settler colonial efforts brought about the demise, the expulsion, and sometimes the elimination of indigenous peoples. Palestinians, too, have been expelled, dispersed, but most of them have lost their homes and country and became refugees. But the refugees did not disappear, and Palestinians managed to recreate the national movement in the 1960s, and they remain a collective political agent. So there are interesting reasons for this. Perhaps we could talk about this later, but for the moment, let me just note this, that some people complain, even now, that 75 years after the Nakba, after the great catastrophe of the Palestinians, there are still Palestinian refugees. There are second and third generational refugees with needs and political aims. So they expect the refugees and the refugee question to evaporate by itself, and it did not. They expect the Palestinians to accept their defeat as final and permanent, but Palestinians refuse. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a source of hope. With all the immense suffering this conflict has caused, it can still have a different resolution. It need not end as many other conflicts engendered by settler colonialism globally that ended in genocide, in ethnocide. But it depends. It depends partly on what we do. Fourth point, the Jews who were integrated into the settler colonial projects were, as we have seen, settlers, often people who had suffered discrimination, oppression, persecution. But this is not exceptional. Colonists in North America, at least in the 17th century, were often persecuted for their religion. Australia was partly colonized by people excluded from respectable positions, from respectable British society, and we have more examples of this sort. Colonists are not demons. They are the human material from a process, and colonialism feeds of a mixture of suffering and profits. So in broad historical terms, we should be thinking honestly about the colonialism of the poor and marginalized. But this should only make us think harder about a way out for them, for everyone. You might think it tragic, and I've heard it often, that in the case of the Jews, people who suffered persecution, the victims of racism and anti-Semitism, hoped to gain a place among the nations by joining the ranks of the colonizing powers. This is history. But consider the early modern Irish immigration to the Caribbean, an early modern economy of slavery and plantations, having suffered centuries of English occupation and colonization. Dispossessed and driven to the western fringes of Ireland, Irish immigrants in the 17th and 18th century sought to improve their lot by migrating to the Caribbean and North America. So the colonized and dispossessed, the Irish, who were described by the English as uncivilized savages, became themselves colonists and integrated into the British colonial system. They became, if you will, they became white, at least in part, in and through the process of colonization. And I think something similar applies to the case we are talking about, and you might discuss the consequences. So I don't need to tell you what needs to be said about the Holocaust, but we should see it in its wider context as the final phase of a process of exclusion and expulsion aimed at forcing Jews out of Germany and the territories under its control and perhaps the European continent, and not only as a result of the systematic campaign of extermination initiated by Nazi Germany, but also, and this I think is important, as the result of joint efforts on the part of its many collaborators and allies throughout Europe, East and West. It was the culmination of a whole tradition of European racism and anti-Semitism. And this has a lot to do with what we're talking about. So for the present purposes, let me just make three comments. The first would be something like this. It is often said that the Holocaust led to the creation of the State of Israel, and this is undoubtedly true, at least in part. The UN resolution of 1947, Resolution 181, ended the British mandate over Palestine and decided to partition it into two states, a Jewish and an Arab democratic state. The Jewish minority, let's look a bit at some numbers, about a third of the population by then, who until then held 6% of the land, was granted 56% of mandatory Palestine, while the Palestinians, 2/3 of the population, were given only 43% of the territory. Clearly, the partition plan was, among other things, an attempt to compensate the Jews by giving them a large part of Palestine. But who was to pay the price? Second point. The Holocaust and the war ended in 1945. Israel was founded in 1948, and the time in between, the post-war years, is crucial. Now, between 1948 and 1951, some 700,000 Jews left Europe for Israel, and about 100,000 immigrated to the United States. The question is, think about those years. Why hundreds of thousands of surviving Jews in Western and Central and Eastern Europe did not feel safe in Europe after 1945? My mother and her sister, the only survivors, were among them. She was 10 years old. Did she know anything about Palestine? Nothing. But she knew that she could not stay. She could not stay in Europe after the war and the Holocaust. And as we know, European anti-Semitism, that I do not belittle, did not die out after 1945. So when the Jews left Europe to settle elsewhere in Arab Palestine, the Palestinians were made to pay for European racism and anti-Semitism, for European guilt by losing land and becoming refugees. Third comment, the partition of Palestine, much like that of India, which took place almost at the same time, was accompanied by violent clashes, mass expulsions, and a bloody war that was concluded in 1949. Israel emerged victorious, and it expanded its territory considerably by annexing large parts of the territory that the UN actually assigned to the Palestinian state. You can see I hope you can see that rather than 56%, Israel got 78%, leaving the Palestinians 23%. And the Kingdom of Transjordan, we call it Jordan today, controlled by the British, annexed the other part of Palestine allocated to the future Palestinian state, the West Bank, with Israel's tacit approval. So when considering how the Palestinian people were prevented from realizing the right to self-determination, we should think about an unholy alliance. We should not forget the role of Arab dictatorial regimes. They were and remain Israel's allies. 4, the Palestinian state, was never established. Some 750,000 Palestinians were uprooted, expelled, and never allowed to return. This is one of the very few images we have of this as it was going. This is a series of amazing photographs by one of the most important photographers of the period. And you can see the cars, you can see the soldiers, you can see the people. It did not happen this way always, but we almost have no images. But then I'd like to go back to the question of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. How can we explain that this great catastrophe, in which large part of a people turn into a people of refugees, how can we explain that this catastrophe was internationally ignored and tolerated, and is tolerated and accepted even today? It is as if the Holocaust has cast a long shadow over the fate of the Palestinians, as if their suffering had no place. So the intense awareness of one suffering, and I do not deny this suffering, that of the Jews, blinded many to the terrible injustice done to the Palestinian. Which brings us back to the context of the current round of bloodshed. At its heart lies not only the ongoing Israeli occupation of the rest of historic Palestine in 1967, but also the unresolved issues of 1948. That of Palestinian self-determination, obstructed, and that of Palestinian refugees. Not only individuals, families, and the loss of their home, a property, but the collective plight of an entire people. Now, in the southern part of Palestine, Palestinian coastal strip, after 1948, a new entity emerged, an enclave of about 350 square kilometers, where 200,000 Palestinian refugees found shelter in camps. Yes, this was the beginning of what we now call the Gaza Strip, a complete new invention of a tragic geography. And for obvious reason, I will try to move quickly and focus on Gaza from now on. Why is Gaza so important? Many people have heard about the place only because of rockets and bombings. So let me say this in this way. First, it is the largest concentration of Palestinian refugees who managed to stay in Palestine after 1948. They lost their homes, they were expelled, but at least they stayed in the country. The Gaza enclave is not a historical region of Palestine. It can hardly exist without its hinterland, without its links with the coastal strip and the whole southern part of the country, with Hebron and the Beersheba areas. The mere creation of this strange enclave, we might use other names for it, is an open wound. And Gaza is not marginal to Palestinian history. In the 1950s, it was one of the most important sites of cultural life and for the emergence of the Palestinian national movement. And it was occupied in Israel more than any other part because it was occupied in Israel already in 1956. And after a few months, Israel was forced to withdraw. But even in the short period of military occupation, around 3 months, Israel was already planning to establish settlement in the Gaza Strip. So when the next Israeli occupation, the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights began after the Six-Day War in 1967, the people of Gaza had no illusions. They remembered the 1956 occupation. So the political response to Israeli occupation was also different. In Gaza, Muslim and Christian Palestinian leaders sat together in the first months after the 1967 occupation to think about how to resist together the occupying power. At the same time, the Israeli authorities began planning to build settlements in the overcrowded Gaza Strip. And it was already clear then that there was a shortage of water in the Gaza enclave. But the settlements were built, one after the other, and they took as much land and as much water as they needed. And Palestinian workers, many of them children and young people from the refugee camps, worked for the settlers. This was the first time in the Israeli press of the 1970s where the Israeli press began talking about colonialism for the first time. Now, of all the occupied territories, only in Gaza did Israel also face stubborn military resistance after occupying the area in 1967. In Gaza, guerrilla warfare, sometimes flanked by attacks against civilians, had a real social basis in the overcrowded and impoverished camps of the refugees. So in no other area in the West Bank was Palestinian resistance also quashed with such brutality. It took Israel 4 years to conquer Gaza after it had been conquered in 1967. And in 1971, General Ariel Sharon and his troops encircled Gaza, entered the camps, rounded up the men, demolished houses, killed whomever they suspected of association with the Palestinian resistance, and tried also to expel leaders and whole families to the desert. So Gaza has a history, and without this history, we cannot look at what is happening there now. And there are further peculiarities to the history of Gaza Strip. All Zionist parties, without exception, supported after 1967 the annexation of Gaza to Israel. The problem was that they wanted the territory, but not the people. They wanted to get rid of them. So for years, efforts were made by Israel to empty the Gaza Strip of its population. Israel sought to drive out as many Palestinian refugees as possible from the Gaza Strip. And it was not until 1973 that the Israeli army realized that it could not empty Gaza. So if you will, Gaza is a problem for the whole system of domination for decades. So after realizing that Gaza cannot be emptied, and you must have heard Israeli politicians who called for evicting the people of Gaza for the past months quite openly, but after around 1973, Israel realized that it cannot evict all of them. Israel wavered between two strategies, and we are coming almost to the present. Either integrate Gaza in the Israeli economy, or isolate it completely and turn it into a closed enclave. The first strategy brought thousands of Palestinian workers to Israel. Some of Tel Aviv that I know, that I love, was built by Palestinian workers from Gaza, who went every week or every day from the camps of refugees to rebuild the Hebrew city, something unimaginable today. But if you look at it as a whole, this strategy failed completely, and the Palestinian uprising, the Intifada, broke out first in Gaza, in the camps of the refugees in December 1987. And its driving force were Palestinian workers, many of them the refugees and sons of refugees who were working in Israel. We now have studies showing how the fact of working with Israel brought Palestinian workers from different parts of the occupied territories together, and that's actually was the basis for the first Palestinian uprising. So it was in the context of the problem of how to control, how to rule Gaza, that a third strategy, perhaps a variant of the second, gradually took shape. The creation of some form of Palestinian local governance, of a Palestinian authority that would be granted a degree of autonomy and, without risking Israel's overall superiority, would be entrusted, how should I say it, with a day-to-day management of suffering and deprivation. It took several years until 1993 for this option to gain the upper hand, and Gaza's isolation and growing deprivation were the basis, later, for the rise of radical Islamists who finally took power in 2007. So I took the longer view, and I'm saying very little about the past 20 years, but I hope you can make sense of them by looking at the structures and the processes as they unfold. So this more recent history should be more familiar to you, because since then Islamic forces in Gaza have presided, have administered the daily misery, and Israel has acted as if it had nothing to do with it, no responsibilities, no obligations. This is our responsibility. Gaza has been aptly described as the largest open-air prison in the world. So let the prisoner committee run the place on their own. Islamist military forces in Gaza then have used repeatedly rockets to attack Israeli civilians, And Israel has retaliated again and again with ever more intense military attacks capable of inflicting a far greater toll in human lives of destruction. This is a spiral of violence that has intensified in recent years, and what we have seen in the last 9 months is its radicalization, but the structural causes, even the pattern of mutual killing and destruction, they go further back, and they will not disappear. This does not mean that Hamas can be absolved of its responsibility. Neither its responsibility for war crimes committed against Israeli, Jewish civilians, whose families and their families, crimes against migrant workers who have nothing to do with the conflict, and crimes against Palestinian workers who were also killed on October 7th. Nor can Hamas be absolved of responsibility, political responsibility toward its own people. But unless we reflect on the kind of conditions that gave rise to extreme forms of destruction and to indiscriminate violence, we will not be able to put an end to the bloodshed and find a way out. This is almost a conclusion. I hope you're not too depressed. Why am I telling you this? To put it simply, there has never been peace between Israel and Gaza. There's no reason to be nostalgic. There is violence of varying intensity, but no peace. In Gaza, as in Lebanon in the 1970s and early 1980s, Israel faces the open wounds of 1948. It is confronted with the question of Palestinian refugees, which it has so far refused to recognize, to acknowledge. In Gaza, 1948 is not history. It is part of the present. So the old men you see roaming the sands of Rafah and Deir el-Balah in the terrible heat of the summer are often refugees displaced for the second or third time, or the sons and daughters of such refugees, and so are the children who are suffering hunger. They may be their children, their grandchildren, and sometimes their grandchildren. So, first and foremost, we have to stop the war. We have to face the most burning issue, the ongoing occupation. The Israeli occupation is the second longest military occupation after the Second World War. You can guess what the longest occupation is. It takes an empire to do this. This is the Chinese occupation in Tibet. We are the second longest. But our problem goes beyond that. It's about whether we can heal the deeper wounds, whether we can stop the process of colonization and dispossession. Unless we do so, we, all of us, cannot live in peace. This remains the basic issue. Can Jews in Israel disentangle the national identity from a settler colonial project? Can we Israelis realize that reconciliation with the Palestinians is also the key to a legitimate and safe political existence in the Middle East? So, what could be the foundations for life in common? Simple. They are easy to name, but they are difficult to achieve. And I'm not going to tell you, but perhaps you'd like to debate it, whether it should be one state, two states, a confederation, or any other political arrangement. At the moment, there is no political solution on the table that guarantees a chance for all to live in peace and prosperity. What matters now are the basic principles that should underpin any political settlement. One state, two state, whatever. The question is, what kind of principle should underlie any political arrangement? So, it's freedom for all, equal rights, not just for individuals, but for collectivities, collective equal rights. Israelis and Palestinians have the right to self-determination. Then it means dealing with the consequences of years of conflict, the deep scars it has left in people's lives, in our culture, in social relations, in structures of gender and family. getting rid of, coming to terms with this imprint is far longer than finding a political solution. And we must reflect on a measure of historical justice, redistribution after years of oppression and dispossession. So, yes, Jews in Israel are entitled to recognition and full respect for their collective rights. So do the Palestinians. Jews in Israel have a right to security. Yes, no less and no more than Palestinians. True, Jews in Israel have reason to fear for the future, even though Israel has the most formidable and deadly war machine in the Middle East. But Palestinians have no less and even more reasons to fear for their lives, their belonging, and the future. Then the role of Europeans in general, and Germans in particular, is not blindly to support one party, in this case, Israel. It does not bring us closer to true peace, quite the opposite. It contributes to ongoing bloodshed and further colonization. This is not the way to come to terms with past sins. The lessons of the past are that regimes based on racism and privileges are simply dangerous for all, that only equal rights, freedom, and democracy for all, without distinction, can allow us to live in dignity. So perhaps I should say this more clearly, even sharply. Taking historical responsibility for the Holocaust, coming to terms with a long tradition of anti-Semitism and racism, European tradition, and specifically a German one, is essential, and I have deep respect for this. But what does it really mean? Does it mean ignoring the historical injustice done to the Palestinians? Can one truly come to terms with a history of the discrimination and persecution of Jews by supporting colonization and dispossession? Is this Wood's way to express our commitment to equality and human rights? There is a German historical responsibility to the Jews, but there is also a German and a European historical responsibility toward the Palestinian people. The Palestinians are not supposed to pay for Europe's crimes against the Jews. And the way to come to terms with the past is by promoting a future that guarantees human dignity and freedom for all. So, for the Palestinians, the challenge is to achieve emancipation, true emancipation, to free themselves from subjugation, dispossession, and achieve political sovereignty and secure their hold over the land. And the challenge for Israeli Jews has to do also with human emancipation, with social emancipation. It is to free ourselves, to disentangle our national collective rights from a settler colonial project, to become a Middle Eastern people that respects and recognizes the Palestinians and our Arab neighbors, and perhaps thus to become a respected neighbor. Thank you very much for your attention, for listening. Thank you.